Yes, okay. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anne Griselli, and I'm very happy to welcome you to today's symposium on Making Modernism in Imperial Germany that my colleague and friend Kelly-Ann Sabin and I had the great pleasure of putting together with the Courtauld Research Forum and with the kind and attentive support of Acacia Finbo in particular. And of course, we are exceptionally grateful to the Tavawatsa Foundation for their incredible generosity, and without whom we would not be able to put on today's event. And just to briefly introduce ourselves, Kelly currently completed her MRes at the University of Nottingham, where she studied Paula Modersohn-Becker and concepts of identity as explored through self-portraiture. And I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, and I co-convene the Research Forum for German Visual Culture, and I study Vasily Kandinsky and principles in visual perception. So it feels great to be in London with you all today and right in the heart of where Dot Price brought to life her brilliant and thought-provoking exhibition, Making Modernism at the Royal Academy. Of course, the idea behind this symposium is, of course, directly tethered to the show, which illustrates and elevates the voices of key women artists working in the early 20th century, and the critical role that they played in conceptualizing modernism. And I hope everyone has had or will have the opportunity to go see the show, which of course is still on for the next week until the 12th of February. So Kelly and I are especially delighted to be able to celebrate this show today, and we will hear exciting new research from our leading experts in the field, Dr. Lynette Roth, Dr. Nina Lubrin, Dr. Deborah Luer, Dr. Natalia Sidlina, and Professor Dot Price. We will begin by hearing papers from Lynette, Nina, and Deborah, who will join us remotely today. And there will be an opportunity to ask our speakers questions after all three have presented, which will be followed by a tea and coffee refreshment break for all. And then we will hear our keynotes, Dot and Natalia, in conversation. And please feel free to join us for a glass of wine after the event has concluded this evening. So without further ado, we can get started, and I am thrilled to be able to welcome Dr. Lynette Roth, who is Daimler Curator of the Busch Reisinger Museum. Her research focuses on art from German-speaking countries of the 20th and 21st centuries. In addition to rethinking the museum's core holdings of German Expressionism and 18th century porcelain, Roth's current projects include exhibitions on women makers in the history of the photogram and issues of German art and identity after 1980. So thank you. I will hand it over to Lynette.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. And also to Kelly, and of course to the Courtauld Research Forum for the kind invitation to come to London and participate in today's workshop, and also to have the opportunity to see the exhibition Making Modernism at the Royal Academy, which I very much enjoyed. Before I begin, I also want to thank Astrid Becker of the Nolde Stiftung Seebuhl and Birgitte Kurz of the Documenta Archive in Kassel for their recent and very helpful conversations with me about the painting that I'm going to talk to you about today. And I should add, I just came from Germany, where I was on quite a tour and pretty much talking to everyone about this painting, which has been occupying a lot of my thoughts over the last 2 years or so. Okay. Acquired in 1954, Emil Nolde's Mulatto, 1913, is one of the most significant German Expressionist paintings in the collection of the Busch Reisinger Museum at Harvard University. Painted more than a century ago and praised already then for its luminosity, Nolde's painting depicts a woman with her eyes closed, her slightly open mouth revealing a few teeth in a sly smile. Around her bare neck is a thick beaded necklace with a large blue gemstone. An oval shape surrounding her head and torso rhymes with the rounded shape of her hairstyle, held back from her face with an equally rounded turquoise band. Nolde's background of thickly applied brushstrokes in yellow, red, and orange follow suit and create a circular dynamism, especially around the sitter's head. And in fact, whoops, sorry, I just meant to use the pointer. In fact, we can see actually that these yellow brushstrokes were the last ones applied, kind of creating this circular motion, and even yellow applied here to the edges of her hair, which really makes her feel like she's emerging from that background. Positioned slightly off-center to the right of the nearly square canvas, the figure leans her head in the opposite direction. And this creates a sense of motion, even though we do not see her limbs. The work's title, Mulatto, albeit misspelled, is written in black paint in the artist's hand on the painting stretcher and refers solely to the subject's mixed race heritage. In common use then, the term is now considered offensive for the way it devalues people based on their Black ancestry. And we've always flagged that in the label in the galleries for this painting. You will forgive the fact that I will continue to use the title of the painting today, which is also something we can talk about, because I noticed in Dot's exhibition, she chose to change the name of a painting by Münter for similar reasons. Because Nolde rarely conformed to naturalistic color choices, this title is key, however, to the reception of this work and the understanding of the red, purple, white, and blue brushstrokes of the figure's face, mixed primarily on the surface of the canvas itself, as suggestive of a dark-skinned subject. Although the painting is composed like a portrait, a woman at her toilette, the sitter's identity remains unknown. Since its acquisition by the Busch-Reisinger, Nolde's Mulatto has been on near permanent view and lent to major exhibitions of Expressionist art. The museum's acquiring curator, Charles Kuhn, chose it as the frontispiece of his 1957 book, German Expressionism and Abstract Art, and the motif has graced collection postcards over many decades. We see it here in our gallery in 1914. I'm in the wrong century. In 2014, alongside the work of Nolde's Expressionist contemporaries, including Erich Heckel, Carl Schmidt-Rotloff, Vasily Kandinsky, Franz Marc, and to the far right, a recent acquisition of a still life painting by Gabriele Münter. And I should say, in the spirit of the Making Modernism exhibition, that the early acquisitions of Expressionism by the Busch-Reisinger were predominantly the work of men, with the exception of the work of Kathe Kollwitz. And we do now own important works by Paula Modersohn-Becker and also Gabriele Münter. Founded officially in 1903 as the Germanic Museum, the Busch-Reisinger has as its focus the art of Northern and Central Europe, with an emphasis on German-speaking countries. In September 2021, after an 18-month closure due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Harvard Art Museums reopened and launched Reframe, an initiative to, quote, examine difficult histories, foreground untold stories, and experiment with new approaches to the collections that would better reflect the concerns of our world today. Among these issues were race, migration, identity, and belonging. Art historians today, driven in part by growing public acknowledgement of atrocities committed by European colonial powers and the pervasive effects of occupation and genocide, recognize the need to address the colonial implications of art from earlier periods, as well as our own. As part of this project, I reinstalled Nolde's painting on the central sightline to the Busch-Reisinger Museum galleries, and alongside it, a large painting by Otto Müller entitled Nude in a Landscape. The gallery introductory text, highlighted with a bright orange graphic indicator, explicitly addresses the colonial implications of German Expressionism. Germany's colonial history may have been comparatively brief. The country lost its colonial territories after its defeat in the First World War, but its legacy is pervasive. Like many of his contemporaries, Nolde believed non-Europeans to possess so-called authentic qualities, free of European society's restrictive codes of behavior. And he relied frequently, as in the painting here, on a common Western trope of the romanticized, exoticized other. Painted halfway through the following decade, Müller's painting too depicts a female figure, but here the woman is seen fully in the nude, standing strong and centrally located, her arms extended like the trees around her. Although it bears a simple descriptive title, the motif was likely influenced by the artist's extensive travels through the Balkans, an interest in the Sinti and Roma people who were marginalized in Europe at the time as well and referred to derogatorily as gypsies. As Dot Price notes in her Making Modernism essay, the issue of primitivism was for a long time, quote, absorbed largely unquestioningly into a canon of modern art. And although art historians of German Expressionism have since done considerable work in this area, they have only recently begun to draw substantially on the field of Black German studies. And I should say that for me, this research is very much a work in progress, and I'm very grateful to the work of Dot, Natasha A. Kelly, Fatima El Tayeb, Tina Kant, and many others. This is important because Black German studies allows to further rethink the relationship of race in the narrative of German nationhood and modern German art. And these are both subjects very much at the heart of the Busch-Reisinger Museum. What is more, the examination of a painting like Mulatto underscores the long history of art objects and their perpetually renewed contextualization and instrumentalization, and how that can affect what we as viewers see and perceive. When it entered the Busch-Reisinger Museum collection, Mulatto was dated 1915, a dating likely based on a pencil notation on the verso. A Dresden catalog from 1927 also lists the painting as 1915. Due to this dating, the portrait was long presumed to represent a colonial subject in German New Guinea, a motif that could have been inspired by Nolde's participation in a government-sponsored colonial expedition to the South Seas from the fall of 1913 to the summer of 1914. While on this trip, Nolde made watercolor portraits and paintings of the island natives, works that often blatantly ignored the colonial presence that Nolde both represented and himself found oppressive. After his imperial voyage, Nolde critiqued German colonialism as corrupting the culture of indigenous peoples. A Busch-Reisinger Museum label, written sometime after 1983, describes the painting thus: as though set against the blazing aura of a tropical sun, the woman's face itself is aglow with florid pink and scarlet tones. The tactile surface of the heavily and furiously applied paint intensifies the immediate and enigmatic sensuous appeal of the unknown islander. Based on an exhibition catalog from 1918 and the artist's own detailed paintings list, which we see here, however, we now know that Mulatto was completed in 1913, before Nolde leaves for the South Pacific. The correction was noted by the Nolde Stiftung in 1984. Nolde's Mulatto is thus now understood not as an individual from a so-called primitive tribal community. Rather, the subject's jewelry and heavily applied makeup suggest that she is a Black stage performer in the burgeoning Berlin metropolis, where Nolde was in 1913 from January to March. Indeed, the fact that she is identified by the artist solely by race allowed for the very mutability of her identity in the work's reception, from tribal native to demi-monde performer. In the latter reading, the bright yellow circle surrounding the woman like a halo evokes a mirror. The garish orange of the background, not the blazing tropical sun, but a reflection of gaslight backstage. A growing metropolis in the early 20th century, Berlin attracted diverse ethnic groups, particularly in the realms of art and theater. Nolde wintered in the capital each year, and while there depicted scenes of modern urban nightlife. The artist frequently went to the theater, the circus, cafes, cabarets, and dance halls, sketching performers and audience members. For Nolde's painting, this means that his subject was likely part of a nightlife scene featuring the so-called exotic, a role often dealt with crudely for non-white performers in Germany. While the story of Black Germans dates back to the Holy Roman Empire, the birth of modern Black Germany, according to art historians Dorothy Price and Camilla Smith in a recent article, quote, can be traced to the 1884 Berlin West Africa Congress and its aftermath, the so-called Scramble for Africa by the major European colonial powers. As historian Robbie Aitken has noted, quote, the onset of German colonial rule in Africa brought increasing numbers of Black men and women to Germany. Pre-1914, the vast majority of these Africans can best be described as visitors or sojourners, and the Black population as a whole was a transient one. The interpretation of the Nolde painting as a performer aligns well with his depictions of the same in other media, such as this lithograph entitled Actress. And in fact, this print has quite a few similarities to the painting in the Busch-Reisinger Museum's collection. And if we imagine that as a print, it's the reverse of what the drawing would have been, perhaps we could imagine that Nolde created it after he had made the painting. Here too, the darkened areas on the subject's cheeks and chin suggest heavily applied makeup or the signs of natural exertion on stage. Except that here, without Nolde's recourse to painted color, which really is his hallmark, such flushed vitality reads instead like gashes or even clown makeup. Lighter areas around the eyes and mouth, even causing this performer to appear as if wearing blackface. In its depiction of a performer, Nolde's painting also reminds us of photographs of circus workers by German artist August Sander for his ambitious typology, People of the 20th Century. The circus, like the nightclub, synonymous with dangerous and so-called primitive types in popular culture. According to art historian Catherine Tubb, quote, while Sander expressed apparent sympathy for his subjects' marginal status, his pictures of them nonetheless recall the motifs used to represent them in mainstream culture. As a painter, Nolde did much the same, even though he may not have been depicting a single individual. As we know that he did not typically use sketches as direct studies for his paintings, and our painting also has little in common with the sketchy quality of a work such as A Glass of Wine. Instead, the composition of our painting, as we have seen, is thoroughly composed. Despite its prominence in the literature as a standalone illustration, the specifics of Mulatto as a painting are addressed in surprisingly few commentaries. And in these, race, though never mentioned explicitly, is ever present. German art critic Will Grohmann wrote of it in 1925, quote, "It originates with a vision of the South Seas that combines inexplicably with the mysticism of a northern person. The exotic with Nolde is thus always fairy tale-like, German, not ethnographic. The two elements pervade one another with the power of related chemical substances so that there is never the effect of a foreign body," end quote. 10 years later in Nazi Germany, Max Sauerland, former director in Halle and one of Nolde's longstanding supporters, attempts to argue for Nolde's painting as inspired by German traditions and an interest in, quote, primordial people, predating his travels to the South Seas. The 1913 painting, Sauerland argues, needs to be understood as it relates to, quote, masked dances, still celebrated through the mid-19th century, also in Germany, end quote. Indeed, what both men struggle with here is that the subject of Nolde's painting is both a Black one and a German one. 1913, the year Nolde painted this work, was notably the very same year legislation was passed in Germany that made, quote, German blood the sole criterion for citizenship as a way to exclude Germans of African descent, a law that was changed only in the year 2000. Represented here in vibrant colors, the unnamed subject of Mulatto, or the woman or women on which the portrait was based, lived and worked in Germany despite having no legal protection. Before it became a core part of the Busch-Reisinger collection, Mulatto belonged to the Moritzburg Museum in Halle, which was one of the leading collections of modern art during the Weimar period in Germany, on par with the National Gallery in Berlin. The painting had been purchased by Halle in 1924 from major Frankfurt collector of German Expressionism, Rosie Fischer, who had bought it with her husband Ludwig in 1918. In 1937, Mulatto was removed from the Halle Museum by the National Socialist authorities, alongside 146 other works as part of the so-called degenerate art campaign. The painting was then prominently featured in the infamous Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich that same year. And we see it here in room number 4, alongside work by Heckel and Schmidt-Rutloff. It then traveled to further venues of the exhibition in Berlin, Leipzig, Düsseldorf, and Salzburg. The Nazi campaign against degenerate art removed more work by Nolde from German museums than that of any other artist, a total of 1,052 works. And it should be said that that's also because Nolde was so highly successful that he had works in many German museums at the time. Like many other works in the Busch-Reisinger Museum collection, Max Beckmann's Self-Portrait in Tuxedo and Franz Marc's Grazing Horses 4, better known as the Red Horses, among them, Nolde's painting is evidence of the inverse relationship between the German defamation of modern German art and American reception of the same. In other words, the more the Nazis defamed modern German art, the more Americans grew to appreciate it. Here we see the painting on view again in Halle on loan in 2019 when the museum did a reconstruction of their pre-1937 collection. In Nolde's case, the severe defamation of his art led to the post-war characterization of him, also in his own self-stylization, as a resistor, even though he joined a local branch of the Nazi Party in 1934 and repeatedly petitioned the Nazi regime to accept his art. And Sauerlander's publication in 1935, the text that I read you was also a part of this larger campaign to argue for Nolde as a thoroughly German artist. It was long thought that despite such maneuverings, he turned his back on the regime after his art was labeled degenerate. This legacy was examined closely in a 2019 exhibition at the Berlin National Gallery entitled Emil Nolde, the Artist During National Socialism. And although the post-war or the posthumous edition of the artist's autobiography, which first appeared in 1934, deleted some, but not all of his anti-Semitic passages, the project made clear that Nolde became an increasingly radical anti-Semite as the war progressed. I think maybe Debbie just joined us. The team of curators laid these facts bare and asked the question, what does that mean for Nolde's art? The very public discussion around the exhibition led to the removal of 2 Nolde paintings, including his 1936 landscape Breakers, seen here, from the office of former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, seen here with former American President Barack Obama. Contemporary artists, too, have drawn attention to this debate. Here we see Berlin-based East German-born Henrike Naumann, whose own work examines the rise of neo-nationalism in Germany since reunification in front of Nolde's Breakers. Her t-shirt reads, "Lie." To this day, the American reception of German art still revolves around Expressionism, and a belief supported by myths such as those created around Nolde that artists who left Nazi Germany or those whose work was declared degenerate were necessarily anti-fascist. Indeed, a 1953 article reporting on the Busch-Reisinger Museum's growing holdings discusses work by Nolde on view under the heading "Good Germans." The truth is that most modern artists who were racially and politically accepted by the regime, while not necessarily party members like Nolde, nonetheless stayed in Nazi Germany throughout the war. It is also important to note, as art historian Aya Soike has done as regards to Nolde, that a ban on one's artistic career, or even on painting, was not equivalent to being racially persecuted or murdered during the Nazi period. It is long overdue then, as in the Berlin Nolde exhibition or my own 2018 exhibition Inventur, Art in Germany 1943 to 55, to re-examine the work of these artists, as well as our own insistence on the notion of the response to National Socialism as fight or flight. As it so often is, the reality is much more complex. Race is central to recent deconstructions of Nolde's self-stylized myth as well. Despite the artist's own anti-Semitism and his support for the Nazi Party, Mulatto, as we have seen, has become a familiar symbol of the art they so vigorously suppressed. After the reopening of the Harvard Art Museums in 2021, journalist Murray White of the Boston Globe reviewed the Reframe initiative. He wrote, "On the way into the galleries holding a clutch of German modern art, the doorway squares up Emil Nolde's Mulatto, 1913, his portrait of a woman of mixed race. A panel of text bracketed in bright orange describes how cosmopolitan Germany devolved into institutional bigotry." White, in his article, characterizes the Nolde as one example of, quote, ugly passages in the collection. And in the caption seen here, he refers to the painting itself as, quote, disparaging. Is this a reaction to the painting, to the work's problematic title, or to Nolde's own racist views during the Nazi period? For art historian Christian Wykop, the work, quote, seems joyful rather than condemnatory. A fact he notes is ironic, considering Nolde's later autobiographical statements condemning the depiction of mixed race people. Since its reinstallation, some students and visitors have asked why we show the painting in the museum at all. It thus seems we might be returning to an observation from a 1928 review referring to Nolde's formal provocations, in which it was written, "In regard to the work of the Northern German painter Emil Nolde, there are only two positions, for and against." As I mentioned at the outset, my own deep engagement with this painting only just began in recent years. And despite my attention to how this luminous depiction of a Black female performer is at odds with the realities faced by people of African descent in Germany during the country's colonial period, including racist obstacles to citizenship, I, like Wykop, still do not see it as disparaging of its subject. For me, the attraction is also in the painting's very contradictions, most of which can be read on the very surface of the canvas itself. The sitter appears angelic, but is she, for Nolde, also potentially the tragic embodiment of colonial rule, the so-called authentic person made up in the artifice of modern European civilization? As Taub examined with Zander, and Price has done in the current exhibition with the work of Gabriele Münter, might a white European artist in a privileged position depict a person of color as an exoticized other, and yet still reveal much about their subject's humanity, or their own, or our own? What does it mean that we, as the viewer of this painting, take up the subject position as we gaze, as Nolde did, on the reflection in the mirror? Since September 2021, student-facing programming and social media have drawn attention to the label rewrites in the gallery and the painting's recontextualization as part of the Reframe initiative at the Harvard Art Museums. And I see this as actually just another chapter in this painting's long reception history. These conversations, like the one I look forward to having with you here today, are ongoing. And I'm going to make a plug also that the Bush Reisinger Museum also has a virtual forum to explore questions of art and national identity, transnationalism, and our shared global future. And I hope that I can interest many of you to join in that conversation as well. And we did also have fairly recently Dot Price on to talk about her recent projects. So please join us in that forum, and I look forward to our conversation in just a bit. Thank you very much.
The viewers. She looks to be aged about 12 or 13. Her rigid torso, fixed eyes, clenched stomach, tense shoulders, and tightly clamped knees betray a profound bodily unease. Nothing is known about the model, but a preparatory sketch for the painting was discovered some years ago, and it's inscribed with the word Beta, which is a common North German girl's name of the period. Who was Beta? In Worpswede, the prime source for models was the local poorhouse, so not actual peasants. With the population of the disabled, the old, the criminal, the orphaned, and the socially marginal. Modersohn-Becker's response to her poorhouse models, as evidenced in her letters and diaries, was a mixture of sentimental charity, a fascination with the more earthy aspects of a world so different from her own educated middle-class milieu, and amusement at their eccentricities and their dialect. Paula Modersohn-Becker wrote that one of her models, the elderly half-blind Adelheid Böttcher, nicknamed the old Allheit, declared in broad dialect that she prayed to God every day to preserve her from stealing and, quote, whoring. One day on her way home from a modeling session, old Allheit announced, "Now I have to piss, nur muss ich erst pissen gehen," before lifting her skirts and urinating into the bushes, writes Modersohn-Becker. Another poorhouse model was the elderly Anna Schröder, known as Drehbein or three legs, on account of her walking stick. Modersohn-Becker also mentions a 5-year-old girl who had been badly beaten by her mother and who now guarded the poorhouse geese. All of the model's work was motivated by economic need. Modersohn-Becker noted the, quote, financial rivalry among the old poorhouse women. One of them, Big Lisa, once reportedly donned her best bonnet in the hope of being chosen for modeling work that day. The social and financial inequalities between artists and their models left few direct traces in their paintings. Old three legs Anna Schröder appears in Modersohn-Becker's paintings as a quasi-mythical peasant rooted in the land, her gnarled hands indices of an imputed life of hard toil. Anna Schröder's social status as a pauper on the margins of society is here transmuted into metaphor with what Jill Perry terms a heroic, timeless quality. Arguably, Modersohn-Becker was primarily interested in her models' formal qualities as pictorial objects. Her paintings occlude the transactional character of the economic relationship between artist and model. A certain Frau Meyer had spent 4 weeks in jail for having, together with her husband, mistreated her illegitimate child. Modersohn-Becker described the child-battering Frau Meyer as an archetypal mother, and here is Modersohn-Becker. "Today, my blonde woman came again, this time with a boy at her breast. She had to be drawn as a mother. That is her only true function. Delicious, these glowing white breasts in the burning red jacket. The whole had something so large in form and color." Frau Meyer is slotted into a conventional iconographic template, mother, and seen in terms of the exciting formal contrasts between her white breasts and her red blouse. The nude. Although the use of the female, so all what I've discussed so far are clothed models, although the use of the female nude model was embedded in 19th century academic and studio practice, the business of paying women to pose in the nude was fraught with tensions, even in the professional urban context. For one, because women artists were not permitted into most life classes, the only women present in studios were paid models, which resulted in the standard constellation of the life class, a room full of clothed men and one naked female on a dais. The life class was a sexually charged environment in which both homosocial camaraderie and normative heterosexuality were enacted across the bodies of undressed working class women. This atmosphere of homosocial camaraderie was not reproduced in artists' villages. The absence of professional nude models in an official life class was part of the very attraction of village life. The men painters in Worpswede associated the nude with academic studio practice and consequently with what they considered to be an outdated and artificial teaching mode. What they sought in the countryside was a different, more authentic kind of life, a life lived closer to nature. Otto Modersohn, the later husband of Modersohn-Becker and a painter in his own right, enthused upon his first visit to Worpswede in 1890. Academies, professors, cities of art are rejected. Our own striving before nature has become my motto as never before. So academies rejected. The nude model with its connotations of academic artificiality and urban decadence was not compatible with the kind of agrarian romantic place myth elaborated and sought by men in rural locations. The only naked bodies painted in Worpswede by men artists before 1909, were images of boys bathing. Michael Hatt notes that the bathing boy formed part of the 19th century myth of rural innocence. Naked boys, unlike naked girls, fitted into the rural habitat as constructed by artists. But even so, their physicality remained enough of a subliminal threat that it was underplayed and suppressed. In Fritz Overbeck's Summertime Bathing Boys, the boys are so small, it's practically impossible to discern their sex with the eye. Some of the Worpswede men not only rejected the nude as part of the academic system, but evinced an almost hysterical revulsion for the naked female model. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke, husband of Clara Rilke-Westhoff, lived with and interviewed the Worpswede men artists and recorded how the painter Hans am Ende had reviled the goings-on at the Munich Academy, where he had been a student. And quote Rilke, who reports on am Ende. The sober and craftsmanlike schoolwork, which nobody took seriously, tired him, am Ende. Without bringing him even one step forward, drawing after a shared model made him nervous, and he didn't connect properly with his comrades. Rilke also tells how Ottilie Reyländer's teacher, Fritz Mackensen, experienced the masculine banter directed at the nude female model in the Dietz school in Munich as distressing, even threatening. Quote, when an interesting model was posed, he, Mackensen, wanted to work with all his might, to be absorbed, to be alone. He felt fortunate to be allowed to stand before the beauty of this body, and he didn't understand the coarse and silly jokes of the others, the continual commotions and flirtations that made work impossible. This behavior not only disturbed him, it insulted him. This young man was close to tears when he saw these obscenities in a place where he had hoped to find serious friends. Was not art something sublime and sacred? Reminders of the presence of a naked, sexed and real body in the studio and of the carnal response of his fellow students intruded painfully into Mackensen's immersion in the transcendent world of art, without, though, prompting any anti-patriarchal critique. Anxieties around women models could be turned against the entire category of woman. The Worpswede artist Heinrich Vogeler reacted with cathectic disgust to the models in his academic life class at Düsseldorf. In my time at the academy, when I had my own studio and needed female models for the purposes of study, I used to feel disgusted by their wanton attempts to awaken sexual desire in me. I developed the attitude that all women are like this. They cannot understand that art is serious work. For the first 15 years of his sojourn in Worpswede, from 1894 to 1909, Vogeler avoided treating the nude. His principal female model was the always fully clothed Martha Schröder, and this is her here. Vogeler had fallen in love with Schröder soon after his first arrival in Worpswede in 1894, when he was 22 and Schröder 15 years of age. The artist waited 7 years before getting married to Schröder. In his many depictions of her, Vogeler portrayed the Martha Schröder as a dreamy and chaste creature. Schröder's body in this painting is shrouded in a reform dress, which forms an almost solid armor. The hair, used as a sign of women's sexuality by other fin de siècle painters, here forms a tight helmet. Schröder is untouchable and almost hysterically anti-body. Women artists did not share their male colleagues' rejection of academic practice because women had nothing to reject. Female students were not, in most European countries, admitted to state-subsidized art academies. Academicians and bureaucrats cited the alleged and actually often real impropriety of the life class as the reason for excluding women from the academies. And unlike their male colleagues, women were desperate to gain entrance to life classes. In 1897, Clara Rilke-Westhoff campaigned for women's admittance to the anatomy courses for artists in Munich. There exists, she writes, a so-called anatomy. To be precise, it is only for the academy and only for gentlemen. Now tell me, someone, why only for gentlemen? That has to change, and I shouldn't be surprised if we were to force it through. Rilke-Westhoff's optimism was unfounded. When she and her fellow students visited the Bavarian Ministry for Culture and Education, they were bluntly told that ladies attending anatomy classes was inappropriate. The only place where Rilke Westorp was able to receive unfettered tuition in nude life drawing was Worpswede. Paula Modersohn-Becker did manage to attend anatomy lessons at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and waxed enthusiastic over the wonderful instruction she received there. Around the turn of the century, the only artists to treat the nude in Worpswede were the women. Indeed, the principal exceptions to the non-interest in nudes in European rural artist colonies across Europe were women, as for example, the German painter Jelka Rosen and her Swedish friend Caroline Benedicts Bruce in the artist village of Grès-sur-Loing near Fontainebleau in the mid-1890s. Rosen posed nude models in the seclusion of her garden, while Benedicts Bruce sculpted a life-size male nude, I don't think it's this one, a statue of the local baker. This sculpture was displayed in the artist's sitting room with its back to the public, quote, so as not to show its sex, although she had modeled this part in great detail. We have few records of what villagers themselves thought of modeling in the nude. However, there is some evidence from other places, but Worpswede, that locals could find the practice problematic. In many villages, women and men could not be persuaded to pose without clothes. For example, when Laura Knight needed topless models in Newlyn in the early 1900s, she had to import professionals from London. In the Netherlands, the fishing women of Volendam allegedly did not even take off their clothes when washing themselves. A woman named Dirkje Dekker was reputed to have posed naked for the painter Gary Melchers and others in the fishing village of Egmond, and as a consequence was still labeled a prostitute by locals over 50 years later. The tension between villagers and the nude goes beyond models' resistance. Oh, and here is, no, hang on. The very real body of rural workers were not easily assimilable to the ideal of the nude. Myths of the rural were fundamentally resistant, even opposed to the nude. The rural cancelled out the nude, and an exception such as Pablo Picasso's image of a Dutch nude peasant only brings this into focus, I think. In Worpswede, it was easier to secure girls for naked modeling than adult women. And although Mackensen did not draw from the nude himself, he did employ village girls to pose for his life class. Modersohn-Becker, Rilke, Westorp, and Reylaender all benefited from this. Modersohn-Becker wrote in 1898, I am very much enjoying my nightly life class. Although the little girl is knock-kneed, she moves with such naive grace. Still, village girls were apt to feel embarrassed about taking their clothes off before a stranger from town. Reluctance to pose in the nude could be overcome by the use of cash incentives. Modersohn-Becker. In the evenings, I am now drawing from the nude, life-size. Little Meta Fior with her little devout Cecilia's face is my first model. When I told her to get completely undressed, the little energetic personage replied, no, I won't do that. I persuaded her into a semi-nude, and yesterday, by use of 1 mark, I softened her completely. But inwardly, I blushed and hated myself for being a temptress. If we compare one of Modersohn-Becker's paintings, the Worpswede Peasant Child, with Reylaender's Beta Nackt, the differences between the two artists' conceptions may be brought into sharper focus. Both pictures show a girl on a Worpswede chair, facing the viewer frontally and within a vertical format. The most obvious difference between the two is the fact that Modersohn-Becker's girl is clothed in a striped child's dress and wooden clogs. In addition, the rounded face, the chubby hands, and her small size in relation to the chair make the girl seem younger than the model in Beta Nackt. It is true that both Beta and the model of Worpswede Peasant Child gaze out at the viewer, but the eyes of Modersohn-Becker's girl are large and round with slightly drooping upper lids. No whites show below the brown circles of the pupils, unlike in Beta Naked. Modersohn-Becker's girl does not so much appear to be staring out at us than to have turned her gaze inwards. By contrast, Reylaender's girl is tense and unquiet. We have no childlike pudgy flesh, The emphasis is instead on muscles and bones. The rectangle, which forms a kind of angular halo behind the clothed girl's head, is an extension of the vertical axis, which seems to fix the figure in space. Modersohn-Becker's nude girl with apple shows a chubby child seated on a draped sofa. Her shoulders sag relaxedly, her torso is slightly slumped. Note the crease mark above the girl's navel. The ankles are crossed leisurely. The girl's head is inclined to one side and her gaze is directed into a vague distance. The apple functions here less as a symbolic attribute of Eve, the temptress, than as a signifier of the world of art. Modersohn-Becker painted numerous still lifes, including ones with apples, and one of the most powerful experiences of her life involved the discovery of Cézanne. The apple in the girl's hands is like an imported piece of still life. When Reylaender, Modersohn-Becker, and Rilke Westhoff chose to paint and sculpt nude girl children in Worpswede, they acted within contemporary dominant paradigms of femininity. Their choice of subject was seen to fall within the natural purview of women, and critics appeal to the artist's supposed maternal tenderness served to take the edge off their unfeminine pursuit of art as a profession. Modersohn-Becker's pictures of children continue to be read in this vein in late 20th century scholarship. Christa Morken-Altrogge understands the nudity in Modersohn-Becker's paintings of children to be an allegory of innocence and authenticity, while Renate Berger has argued that the representation of female children was for the artist a kind of self-portrait of her own inner child as a metaphor for creativity. This kind of innocentization of children is in contrast to how other paintings, for example, by Munch are discussed, or indeed more recent photographs by Sally Mann of her children in the nude, which were, of course, the controversy at the time. And also in a strange, these discussions of authenticity, creativity, and innocence can be mapped on the reception of Brücke painters. Even studies of the overtly eroticized, scholars don't see the overtness, of the overtly eroticized girl models of the Brücke painters from around 1907 to 1911 remain astonishingly free of probing questions. The Brücke artists' main girl models were Lina Franziska Frenzy-Fehrmann and Marcella Sprenzel. The 2014 exhibition in the Berlin Brücke Museum interpreted these models as furnishing the painters with childlike spontaneity, pure and natural. This, in turn, argue the curators, propelled the artists into a new phase of creativity. Such assumptions ignore even artists' own pronouncements. Kirchner wrote of Marcella, "There is a great allure in such a pure woman, which hints that can," sorry, how have I translated this? "There is a great allure in such a pure woman, which hints that can drive you insane, wilder than the older girls, toller." In Beta Naked, we have a female individual being gazed at, but she is not gazed at by a man, and she is arguably not presented as an object for the male gaze. Her own gaze is knowing and active, aware of being beheld and uncomfortable. Beta sexuality is, if anything, locked up inside herself. It is her business alone. She's imbued with markers of agency, outward gaze, a body that does not offer itself up, a bodily wariness. However, it also seems evident that she might never have sat like this herself. Beta was made to do so by the artist. The artist made the girl sit in a way that displays her awkwardness. It is Reyländer's agency that displays a self-conscious awareness of the artist-model relationship and of the difficulties and dilemmas of girlhood. At a time when the artist herself was still a girl, barely out of adolescence, she was 19 years old when she painted Beta. In a number of pictures painted between 1900 and 1902, Reylaender presents a troubled vision of rural life for girls. And I was so happy to see the girl with red blouse in Making Modernism. In Reyleender's images, it is not the women who pose a threat via nature. Nature itself seems to pose a threat to the women. And there's another image of which I don't have a slide, which shows a sort of dark figure emerging from a bush walking towards a young girl walking across a bridge. Or to be more precise, not nature is the threat, but the human acts which may be concealed by a natural or village environment. Reading Reyleender's Beta, Naked and others may help us to refine the image of the artist's colony of Worpswede and also help us to re-examine this moment in art history, the 20 or so years before the outbreak of World War I and the fundamental shift in women's art production represented by the Weimar Republic. And this is a picture by Reylaender once she moved to Mexico in the 1920s. Thank you very much.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Deborah Luer, who is a senior lecturer in history of art at the University of Glasgow and a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. She has published widely on Dada, Expressionism, and wider aspects of German visual culture. And she has a particular interest in the intersection between art, politics, and theology in modernity, and is currently preparing a monograph on Hugo Ball, founder of Dada in Zurich. So please join me in welcoming Debbie, who is joining us here via Zoom.
Thank you so much, Lynette. Can you hear me? Do you mind just confirming that you can hear me?
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm on a new laptop, so I'm just still getting used to it. Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to participate in this wonderful workshop. And I'm just so sorry that I'm not there in person. I fully planned to be there, but it's to do with the rail strike and difficulties in getting from Glasgow to London. So I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to present by Zoom. And I've thoroughly enjoyed the papers that I've heard so far and look forward to further discussions. Thank you also to everyone who has helped with arranging this event and indeed for the invitation. So you'll notice that my paper title has changed. And I've made the decision really in the process of working on this paper to focus on the work of Kathe Kollwitz and to look at her work from a particular perspective. And so that's what I'm going to present to you now. In his well-known essay of 1936, The Storyteller, Walter Benjamin memorably asked, was it not noticeable at the end of the war that men returned from the battlefield grown silent, not richer, but poorer in communicable experience? It's a passage that's often invoked by scholars concerned with artistic and literary cultures of the so-called front experience. My short paper for today has been stimulated both by this question and by the remarkable and important Making Modernism exhibition curated by Dot Price at the Royal Academy that has prompted our gathering. So bearing in mind these works by women artists in Germany and the now quite widely theorized crisis of representation of men's experience in and after the war of 1914 to 18, I want to adopt a slightly oblique focus. In the following, I offer some observations on silence and withholding in some of the wartime graphic work of Käthe Kollwitz. My screen is now intentionally blank just for a short while. Kollwitz's extraordinary images of intimacy feature prominently in the exhibition, of course, showing her work already in a new light. What I offer here is by way of some insight into her dealings with art publications, specifically in the early war years. And I hope too that it might give a new perspective on her images of women, especially mothers, in war. One that attends less to emotional expression than to its limits. Numerous sources from the period show that the search for meaning for forms of communication adequate to the contemporary time, to Kriegszeit, wartime, was registered for some as a crisis in German art. Anxiety around the loaded idea of German art in the war years focused often on embattled concepts of the Gothic, of modernity, and of Expressionism. These were sometimes framed by notions of an authentic, vital, and positively conceived German barbarism in the face of foreign civilization. Yet it can be argued that such dilemmas were complicated by visual responses to the conflict that had about them a quality of restraint, or in Benjamin's terms, silence. In the face of the impossibility of war's representation, I'm suggesting here that a few works of art were made that thematized withdrawal and immobility. In its very reticence, it might be read as a dissenting form of communication, the impoverishment of which was uniquely, and for some observers, irritatingly eloquent. A prominent example, which I'm just showing you briefly here, of something of what I'm describing was the sculpture known as the Dying Warrior, later simply known as the Fallen One by Wilhelm Lembruck. But I want to turn our attention, as I've said, to Kollwitz. Käthe Kollwitz's career was already well established by the time war broke out in 1914. She was widely recognized for her profoundly humane images and had become, in her own words, a person of respect. She worked in the graphic media of etching and then increasingly in lithograph, sometimes combining the two, as we see in this self-portrait. Finally, after the war, in the woodcut medium, she tested and pursued the formal and social problems that concerned her. She was a figure to whom an ability to communicate essential human experiences was habitually attributed. Together with only a few colleagues, such as Ernst Barlach and Wilhelm Lembruck, Kollwitz was recognized as an artist distinct from the perceived mass of mediocrity lamented in some artistic circles. She also worked with a profound understanding, I want to suggest, of the contingencies of war's mediation. Scholars of German literature have persuasively argued that underlying its potent metaphorical evocations of war was a collective unease at the pace of German modernization since the founding of the empire in 1871. So, for the generation of 1914, the relative absence of rational political reasoning for the war created a kind of vacuum in which cultural constructions of the war's meaning not only outweighed, but could actually replace political justifications. Historians, more widely, have recently been careful to modify and relativize accounts of a universal war enthusiasm in August of 1914. But one of the insights to emerge from such work has been that the cultured liberal bourgeois circles from which most modern artists came were those among which the hope of a war to overcome the banality and materialism of the present held most appeal. When war broke out in 1914, one of the first and most prominent responses in the field of the visual arts was the periodical founded by the dealer and publisher Paul Cassirer, titled Kriegszeit, or Wartime. Its inaugural issue featured on its cover a lithograph by Max Liebermann showing surging crowds before the Berlin Palace balcony from which the Kaiser addressed the people in patriotic speeches in July and August of that year. Kaiser Wilhelm's words are energetically scrawled below the image. I no longer recognize any parties. I recognize only Germans. Kriegszeit came out weekly from almost the first month of the war. It featured artists associated with the Berlin Secession, and it offered cheaply the material for feeding an appetite for rapid visual mediation of the war for readers and viewers at home. At the end of September 1914, Kriegszeit featured this lithograph by the Austrian artist and cousin of Cassira, Walter Bondy, on its cover. It showed the High Church of Reims, as it is titled, with the subtitle, A Stronghold of the French Army. The cathedral is represented with a pointedly ambiguous radiance, suggestive both of the grandeur and spiritual significance of the Gothic building and of the explosive flare of artillery fire. A few days earlier, German artillery had carried out the first of many intense bombardments of the cathedral at Reims. Over the next 4 years, the building came under repeated fire, leaving parts of it badly damaged. Images and reports of the so-called German crime were widely circulated. The destruction was widely mobilized for propaganda purposes in several countries. It had a significant impact on international opinion. There were direct and indirect consequences for debates in art and for the academic discipline of art history. The historical sources document a rhetorical conflict that was fought far beyond Reims itself, beyond the material assault on stone, glass, and wood, and beyond the destruction of art. Issues of nationhood and sovereignty, of confessional and secular identities, of spiritual and artistic integrity, past and present, were at stake. Reims's symbolic status and embattled position during the war served to amplify its national and emotional significance. After 1914, the cathedral's wounded, violated body, those are terms, those are in quotation marks, terms that circulated in the discourse, could be readily made to stand outside Germany as an expression of martyred French civilization and of German barbarism, quote unquote, and guilt. Reims in flames became a popular subject, differently represented for postcard images produced in wartime by both the Germans and the French. The French recorded a total of 287 shells known to have struck the cathedral. In Germany, convoluted arguments had to be employed to reach the conclusion, as issued by the German War Ministry, that, quote, the blame for the regrettable destruction lies solely with the French. A couple of weeks later, Kriegszeit published another image, this time of aerial bombardment of Paris, significantly with the Ile de la Cité and the Cathedral of Notre Dame prominently visible, both to the viewer and to the airborne perspective of the German bomber. Now, I'm showing you this really to make a contrast with the first and only work by Kollwitz to appear in Kriegszeit, not long after. And the work is revealing. If the image of the embattled cathedral references the most spectacular of all of the events of the war visually disseminated at that time, Kollwitz's, by contrast, works with economy to resist and close down spectacle and visual pleasure. It withholds narrative resolution. It's an image of singular interiority that is unusual, even out of place, for this very early stage in wartime's popular mediation. As we shall see, it was out of place even in gendered discourse around the early war experience. Kollwitz's unidentified woman is in a state of suspended animation, waiting, as the alternative title of her lithograph has it. There we see it with the title on the left, Das Warten, and the title on the right, Das Bangen. One means waiting, the other means the waiting, the other means the fear. In that inert state and almost shrouded in darkness, she is barely the object, but she is powerfully the subject of vision. The nature of that which this woman sees behind eyes that are closed is withheld, denoted only by the word for the state of anxiety so interiorized here, bangen. At such an early stage in the war's conflict, Kollwitz and the woman engage in an act of visualization strikingly other than that of the illustrated pages of Kriegszeit, full of action, of the technology of war, of its communication. Here's another example from the same issue, again by Max Liebermann, Samaritans in Wartime. Kollwitz gave readers a starkly reduced figure, dissonant with the literary and artistic image currency of the early war years. A closed, silent, still picture of a state of suppressed anguish in the anticipation and in the absence of words, the awaited words of bureaucratic confirmation of death. Here, where I'm speaking to you from, in Glasgow, sunny Glasgow, in the art collection at my own university, we're fortunate to have an outstanding collection of works of art on paper from the era of Imperial Germany. Among them is this remarkable charcoal figure study by Kollwitz from 1905. It's part of a long-standing concern on the artist's part with the effects of death and bereavement. These are indeed, of course, the powerful subjects for which Kollwitz is best known. In the rapidly executed drawing, she attends closely to the bodily gestures of emotional distress, the hands that flutter defensively to the face, as if to seek to shield the woman from pain or from exposure. The lower of the three studies is less agitated, suggesting a quietening, the site of emotion focused on the breast more than on the face, with its capacity for weeping and crying out. When viewed together with the lithograph for Kriegszeit, the latter's expression of another state becomes even more poignant. It's an image of anticipatory grief, in which time is compressed. The subject appears immobilized, standing or perhaps even lying in a death-like state herself, figured before the abstraction of the death notice. The timing of the publication of Kollwitz's lithograph is poignant. That very week, she was struggling with having seen her son, Peter, off to war less than 2 weeks earlier. She wrote in her diary, "I think about Peter. Where is he? Is he cold? Is he hungry? Is he in danger?" Her concerns for the absent son, only 18 years of age, are with the fundamentals of bodily existence. That was on the 24th of October. Kollwitz did not yet know, or at least had no notice, that Peter was in fact already 2 days dead. Just a few days later, she records telling Hans, her surviving son, that she could find no form for what the war had brought her. It's worth noting at this point what is perhaps obvious, that methodologically, one of the great challenges in writing about Kollwitz is precisely how to deal with the overwhelming emotional experience that makes up her subject matter, and that so inevitably pervades scholarship and criticism of Kollwitz's work. It is well known that Peter's death was a loss from which she and her husband never recovered, and to the emotional spectrum of which she returned in word and image for years to come. The call to empathy is also one that impacts on scholarly work, on objectivity, and issues around impoverishment of adequate communication for the substantive nature of the work's effect in the work of art history. It's striking that one of the last images in Kriegszeit before the paper ended was by a lesser-known artist who also gave form to women's experiences of bereavement in war. It's a simpler image, but one in which we also see something of the figure closed in on itself. Attesting to other aspects of gendered experience in the currency of art, the artist's name given in the publication and elsewhere is Erich Thum, but this was in fact a male pseudonym for the female artist Elfriede Thum-Laugner. Elia Burres is a historian specializing in the evolution of radical conservatism in 20th century Germany. In a recent important article dealing with language and the so-called conservative revolution of post-war Germany, Burres has argued that, quote, if the Great War generalized a crisis of representation, it also highlighted the brotherhood of men at war as just such an organic community in which linguistic mediation was comparatively unimportant, end quote. Such perspectives can be borne in mind when considering even some of the content of Kriegszeit, which was comparatively liberal in orientation. And here, one text stands out in particular. There you can see it as it appeared in Kriegszeit in the slide on the left. It was written by a prominent woman who was also a significant voice in the women's movement in Germany, the best-selling novelist Gabriele Münter, who was about 8 years older than Kollwitz. Of note here are Reuter's vivid metaphorics of death and women's experience of bereavement in war. It's an account that pointedly relativizes the emotion of fear that Kollwitz had so mutely visualized in the earlier issue of the journal. And the text is worth reading, so I've translated it here. Reuter wrote, "Truly today, a feeling goes through all our hearts that has nothing more to do with fear, that I would rather call a feeling of readiness. The readiness for any kind of suffering, for any loss, readiness to abstain from all earthly joys and even from life itself. All of us in Germany know it. Man, woman, and child knows it, feels it with the entire soul, that this battle against the overwhelming power of a world can lead only to victory when no fear and no weakness arises in us. Who has the strongest nerves will triumph, and truly we have strong nerves. As death has become our own, nearer, more familiar than we ever believed able to bear, so also our longing. Could any of us ever have known what kind of gigantic mass of love slumbers in the people? Yes, in all the peoples, for in our enemies too, a fiery ocean of longing trembles and hopes and believes. There too, their sacrificial incense offerings rise up towards the heavens and mingle far, far above the battlefields in high, purer airs with those of ours. With those magical powers unites that which will one day inaugurate our spiritual renewal, a strange union pregnant with miracles above the cries of hatred and the noise of the weapons of these days." At first glance, the text contrasts incongruously with the quotidian industriousness of the sewing room of the scene above. The juxtaposition could be read, however, as one visualizing the dual aspects of women's sacrifice in wartime, to give of their daily labor as well as of their children. The vitalism and abstraction of Reuter's account also stands in contrast to Kollwitz's woman. A few months before this text appeared in Kriegszeit, just after the outbreak of war, Kollwitz had in fact read and recorded her own response to another piece of writing by Reuter. The note that Kollwitz made in her private diary is telling, when read with the lithograph, for its sense of fearful anticipation and for its evocation of the darkness shrouding the figure. Kollwitz wrote, Gabriele Reuter wrote in the Tag about the task for women now. She spoke of the voluptuousness of sacrifice, an expression that very much struck me. I fear that after all this spiritual uprising, there will come an accordingly blacker desperation and despair. Kriegszeit ran from 1914 to 1916. By that year of weariness and despair, indeed, with the war and with the growing movement of pacifism, Paul Cassira, who had been working in field hospitals at the front himself and was enduring the effects of trauma that experience induced, supplanted Kriegszeit with a publication much more ambivalent in its tone. It was edited by the pacifist Leo Kerstenberg and called Der Bildermann. Kollwitz contributed one single image to that publication too, and you can see it there on the screen. It represents almost the direct opposite of the image that she gave to Kriegszeit. It appeared in Der Bildermann on the 20th of April, 1916. There we have both of Kollwitz's images for Kriegszeit and Der Bildermann. In her diary, she noted many doomed attempts at drawing something for Kerstenberg's Bildermann. I can't produce anything, a complete failure. And then, a few days later, just a brief remark, doing another drawing for the Bildermann after all, a woman with the child in the arms. The child grabs at the woman's face. No more is said of the image. It's a charming but strikingly conventional image of maternal joy and of happy intimacy between mother and child. In his discussion of Der Bildermann, the historian of the Berlin secession, Peter Parrott, calls it simply uninspired. But let's consider it a little further. It is in almost every respect the inverse of the Kriegszeit lithograph. Given the optimism of the earlier publication and the more somber pacifism of Der Bildermann, the placement of these images by Kollwitz is unusual. I'd like to suggest that they can both be read as images of communicative impoverishment. In different ways, each attests to the incommunicable nature of the experience of war for women in general and for Kollwitz in particular. In the one image, there is the silent restraint and lack of linguistic content on more than one level. In the other, the image of mother and child, the failure to draw, to use Kollwitz's words, has been resolved by the artist in an almost throwaway image that, however lively, is so conventional, so generic, that it may also be read as a kind of silence. By October of 1916, Kollwitz was noting the words of a friend. No one in Germany believes any more in our victory. In a certain peculiarly substantive way, this was another loss, the loss of that expectation. On the 21st of October 1921, very close to the anniversary of Peter's death, Kollwitz wrote, quote, "All of us in all the warring countries have borne the same. I have tried again and again to represent the war. I could never grasp it. Now, finally, I have completed a series of woodcuts that to some extent say what I wanted to say. These sheets should travel everywhere and should say to everyone in summary, that is how it was. That is what we have all borne during these unspeakably difficult years. So to conclude, Wolfgang Natter has aptly remarked that, quote, few issues were as highly contested in Germany after 1918 as the question of how to render meaning unto a war that had left nearly 2 million dead and nearly 5 million wounded, and furthermore had left Germany the vanquished opponent, charged with being the sole culprit for the war's outbreak and devastation, end quote. The unease is memorably symbolized by the figure that appears in Benjamin's storyteller essay, quoted at the outset as, quote, the tiny, fragile human body beneath the clouds and a field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, end quote. Something of the precarity of adequate language, of adequate expression in the lived experience of war and loss is, I think, part of the visual language developed by Kollwitz in those years. I hope that looking at these works together today might enable us to reflect more widely on shifting perceptions of the war and changing ideas about what it meant for women to make art in modern Germany and to speak of what was unspeakable. Thank you.